Welcome to the Hillsdale Online Courses Podcast. I'm Kyle Mernon, the Director of Online Learning at Hillsdale College.
And I'm Juan, the Director of Marketing for Online Learning here at the college. And this is the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. We are currently going through the Real American Founding. Today we are going to Lecture 4, which is titled Foreign and Domestic Policy.
So today's lecture sparked in my mind the question that Dr. Azerrad ended Lecture 1 on, which is, who's your favorite founder? And there's a lot to choose from, and there are a lot of good reasons to choose any number of founders. But my choice would be Ben Franklin, and it's for reasons that are drawn out in the lecture that you'll hear today and what you'll learn today. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most when I was reading a Ben Franklin biography to my kids this week, Juan, and it was really amazing to see all of the remarkable things that he did for the city of Philadelphia as a private citizen because he was knowledgeable, patriotic, and energetic. The roads need fixed. Let's figure it out. We need books. Let's figure out a way to loan them out. Hospital, firefighting, a number of ways and things that we take for granted that are part of American life. He did as a private citizen, and he really had that energy, and he was unleashed by this Republican form of government that we established here at our founding. And I think that's a remarkable thing. I think it's a distinctly American thing, and that example just jumps out at the page for me when I work through this lecture.
Yeah, I'm Franklin is my favorite founder also, well, amongst some of them. But I really like Franklin specifically for that reason that you mentioned, which is that he was a private citizen. And it's incredible what a private citizen can do in this country. And we sometimes forget that that's not the case anywhere else around the world, that the power of that institution of citizenship here is pretty strong, and private citizens can do a lot for the country. But if I'd be forced to choose a founder, I think it would be James Madison. And it is because of one of the things that we will see in this lecture, and it is, what is the purpose of government? It is the most basic question that we should all, as citizens, ask ourselves. What is government supposed to do? And it's a really easy answer, which is secure the rights of citizens. That's it. That's the number one role of government, and we get it so wrong today. And the founders understood that very clearly, especially James Madison, which is one of the primary drafters of the Constitution. And the way they designed our government to be the way it is, it's because of that, because they always had that question in mind. What is the best way of securing rights? Why do you separate it into federal, state, and local governments? How do you think about immigration? How do you think about foreign policy? Well, the answer was, what is best to secure the rights of American citizens? And so that's, I think, why James Madison is one of my favorites.
So Madison and Franklin are two of our favorites. We hope that this course gives you some new ideas about who your favorite founder is. If you take the Dr. West view and start talking about Theophilus Parsons or Zephaniah Swift, we'll be especially proud of you and impressed. And we hope that you continue with us throughout this examination of the American founding. If you enjoy this course, we do hope that you go to hillsdale.edu/course and check out some of our other free online courses. I think one that is especially appropriate for this conversation is our course on American foreign policy. We only get about 10 minutes to be able to talk about it in this lecture. But if you want to really understand the key events, the key history, the people that shaped America's foreign policy, if you want to understand how the founders viewed the great crises and controversies of foreign policy in their day and what their principles were and how that's changed in massive ways today, right? From the Barbary pirates to the Ukrainian war, how have we viewed these conflicts and how have we looked to secure the rights of the American people? That's a fantastic course. Michael Anton is really good at teaching it. He not only teaches that topic here as a lecturer at Hillsdale College, he also served in the National Security Council in both the Trump and Bush administrations. So I think you'd have a lot of fun if you check out American Foreign Policy, which is available, as are all of our other online courses, at hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course.
So let's turn over to Dr. West and Azerrad in lecture number 4, Foreign Policy and Domestic Policy.
So we've established how the founders thought about human beings, that we're equal, no one can rule us without our consent, and that we possess rights. And then there's this phrase that we need a government to secure our rights. Sounds rather obvious in a certain sense, but I find that students are often perplexed when I ask them, well, explain to me what this means. Why do our rights are in need of securing? Or maybe to put it differently, who threatens our rights? Why are they not secure by nature?
Right. No, that's exactly. I have the same problem. What is it the government does to secure our rights? I do think people kind of understand, if you have something like a state of nature, that is a state without government, then people will be predatory in some cases, and that is a bad thing. And so your rights, when you think about what it's like to live outside of government, and there are examples in the world today where government has broken down. Like, for example, in Mexico, parts of Mexico are in a kind of state of nature because nobody's really in charge. The government in charge, the cartel's in charge. So you have people are open to violence of others.
So how does government protect us from the violence of others?
There are three major threats to our rights, our person and property. One from other people you live with in your society, one from people outside your society, and the third from government itself. Because if you have a government that's strong enough to protect your rights against harm from abroad or from at home, they too can threaten your rights. And so there are three phrases that you could use to characterize each of those three things and how government manages to secure rights. One is protection of the laws against violence from your own people. Second is foreign policy, protection from abroad, national defense, in a word. And third, due process of law. The idea that government can't take away your liberty, your property, or your life without following certain procedures that are meant to protect you against unwarranted or inappropriate, harmful behavior by government.
So is the first one then the criminal law?
Protection of the laws primarily means, yes, criminal law enforcement, laws against violence to person and property, theft, assault, murder, rape, embezzlement. So it would include open violence, and it would also include fraud, subterfuge, theft. That would be covered too.
And so you need to pass these laws, and that we still do pretty well in the U.S. But it seems to me today the issue is more on the enforcement side, which is just as much a problem from the point of view of protecting your rights as not having these laws.
Right. That's where it breaks down. You have many local district attorneys and prosecutors who flat out say publicly, we're not going to prosecute certain crimes. We think those crimes are okay. If you're a shoplifter and you've taken something from a store that's below a certain amount, we don't think that's a problem. Many people have seen the videos of these people who just walk into these various drugstores in places like San Francisco and others, take whatever they like off the shelf, don't even conceal it, bring a big bag in. And during the 2020 riots, the BLM protests, people were breaking into businesses, stealing things, and so on. And governments in city after city were announcing publicly, we're not going to prosecute any of those crimes. Those are protests. Protests are something that are a good thing. Of course, always this attitude of selective prosecution of crimes always had some kind of idea that it was either because of race or because of political orientation. And it's unfortunate, but that is where things have gone. The idea of protection of the laws was everyone gets prosecuted, no matter what race committed the crime, and no matter how poor you are or rich. That's a different world now.
Yeah, the law today seems to come down very hard on some people because of political ideology or a type of crime, and then to be quite lax with other parts of the population. So you mentioned the BLM riots. We turn a blind eye. But the January 6th protesters are still languishing in solitary confinement. Many haven't even had charges pressed against them after a full year. One of them committed suicide a couple of months ago, I believe.
So in the case of the BLM rioters who were committing actual crimes against property, sometimes against individuals, assaulting them, burning down buildings. That was a failure of protection of the laws, the idea of equal protection of the laws, that everyone gets prosecuted for committing the same kinds of crime. The January 6th protesters on the other side, that's an example of the breakdown of due process of law, where government is to be restrained from punishing people for things they didn't do, or for things they did which are not as severe as the way they're treated in practice.
So how do you do that? How do you set up a government that is powerful enough to do what it needs to do, but then how do you check it, prevent it from becoming tyrannical or abusing its powers? I know the founders thought a lot about that. What are the broad outlines of their answer?
One of the phrases that's often used to describe their method of thinking about dealing with this is separation of powers. In order for government to provide protection of the laws, it needs to do three things. One, it needs to pass a law in the first place. So an elected legislature forms a consensus. The idea, therefore, being, all right, here's a group of people elected by the people, representative of the public at large. So the laws, therefore, were expected to be not anything that the public at large would disapprove of. Second, you need effective judgment. They have to be brought to trial. And that requires a combination of the executive branch, the prosecutors, and then the judicial, the trial courts. And the main job of the judiciary being hold trials for violations of criminal law or for civil lawsuits. And effective trials, right, where juries are going to look at the law and follow the law, where the judges don't pretend the law is not there when they give sentence. And then finally, you need to have effective punishment. And that's the executive branch. That would be the process of arrest on the one hand, and then the process on the other hand of making sure that the fines are paid or that jail time is served, or in the extreme case, the execution for a capital crime takes place.
And so all three really today have been eroded, right? We pass laws, but a lot of the details get done by bureaucrats or courts who oftentimes just ignore the law. You mentioned that prosecutors are saying we're not going to prosecute certain crimes. We've talked about the problems with jury trials. And then on the last front there's this huge push to decarcerate, as they call it, to empty out the prisons on the grounds that it's racist to incarcerate people and to have people not serve their terms. For a long time, there was a period when the Supreme Court had declared the death penalty unconstitutional, even though the Constitution mentions capital crimes. We still have that to some extent today, but eroded and constantly being eroded. Would you say that's a fair description?
Yeah, I think you're right. But what I would add to that is that we now today have a whole new layer of law, civil as well as criminal law, on top of the older laws that protect person and property. The whole vast regulatory apparatus of the modern state, laws that dictate the details of everything you do. Like when I was driving up to the campus this morning, I saw a truck, just a regular tow truck, and it had a big label on the side, DOT number such and such. You realize that truck could not operate in Hillsdale unless the federal government gave it a permit. Like, what in the world is the federal government doing permitting or not permitting tow trucks in a local community? It has nothing to do with anything in the Constitution, and really has nothing to do with anything in government. I mean, it's fine if you want to regulate with respect to use of interstate highways, fine. But this idea that everything has to be micromanaged from the top down into the details of ordinary life. Not 1 mile of sewer line can be laid anywhere in America without the permission of the EPA. Why? And then that involves a lot of legal enforcement, a lot of prosecutions, a lot of involvement of the federal executive branch or the states, which means a lot of the resources of law enforcement are diverted away from ordinary crime and into this other area, which is arguably, from the point of view of the founders, mostly not even necessary and, if anything, harmful to the freedom of the ordinary citizen.
So you bring up something we haven't talked about yet, namely the fact that, according to the political theory of the founding, we were going to have 3 levels of government: the local, the state, and the national. Today, everyone's obsessed with DC, and in a sense, understandably so. As you pointed out, DC has its tentacles in everything.
Right.
How did the founders think about the appropriate role of each of these three levels of government and how they should relate to one another? What was the division of labor between the different levels of government?
The answer to that question actually opens up a perspective on many things about the founders' understanding of government. But the immediate answer to that is the federal government oversees matters that the states by themselves can't take care of effectively. And that would be first and foremost foreign policy, and secondly, interstate relations. It's relations among the states. So interstate commerce, lawsuits between states, uniform currency for the nation. The Constitution provides for that. Standards of weights and measures that everyone needs to use. That's the old federal role. The original Constitution had some limited federal involvement in protection and regulation of property rights. For example, the Constitution doesn't allow the states to cancel contracts. And so, all right, so there were a few exceptions. By and large, though, the main thing was the states would deal with all kinds of domestic policy questions, whether it be the family, lawsuits between individuals,
Crimes.
almost all crime was local. But as for local government, the states basically had the practice from the very beginning, going all the way back to colonial times, of decentralizing a lot of their own government into the hands of local communities. And the old idea was the principle of consent of the governed. One of the things that it means is all government activity should be done as close as possible to the actual people who have to live under the rules that are promulgated. So there used to be the town would take care of education. The town would take care of police. The town would take care of all local roads, or the county, not even the state. That was regarded as too centralized. Whereas today we're used to the idea of thinking everything has to be handled in D.C. or it won't be done right. A claim that easily can be shown to be counterfactual.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
So let's turn to foreign policy, the third way that the government secures your rights. So if I understand you correctly, in a certain sense, foreign policy is no different than domestic policy insofar as the aim is the same. It's to protect citizens from threats and violence of others. The domestic policy, others being fellow citizens or residents in the country. Foreign policy is foreign nations.
Yes, that's right.
So how does the government do that? Because today when we think about foreign policy, we think that the U.S. needs to be exporting democracy everywhere, overseeing elections, promoting gay rights, toppling governments, sending arms. I mean, no area of the world is off limit. The U.S. foreign policy, that's not how the founders thought about it. How did they think the government should go about protecting Americans from foreign threats?
Well, the very term secure these rights indicates both the purpose and limits of American foreign policy, because it's both the purpose, right, defense, but the limit is it doesn't go beyond defense. The idea that America should be involved in determining the well-being of other countries was foreign to the entire political theory of the founding. The founders said, our relations with Britain will be the same as with other nations. Enemies in war, in peace, friends. Meaning there's a presumption. All nations, the governments of all nations, we will presume to be legitimate and not be in any kind of fight with them as long as they don't want to fight with us.
Even if they're a tyranny.
even if they're a tyranny.
So what gets called neoconservatism, I mean, a neocon would say, but hold on one second. We are dedicated to the proposition that human beings are equal and free. How can we be indifferent to the fate of liberty abroad? How can we be friends with a tyrant who ruthlessly oppresses his own people? Isn't that un-American?
You can argue that, and what the founders said about that was, yes, we think that there are some governments are better than others, and we will be happy to say so. The famous John Quincy Adams line, and I don't want to say he wasn't a founder, I mean, basically, but he was in the spirit of the founding insofar as he argued America has no business interfering with or trying to improve other nations, but it does have a mission of being an example to the world of good government. And what we will do with those other nations that are struggling to achieve liberty is we will cheer them on from afar by our example and our best wishes. But he made a distinction between verbal approval and actual involvement.
So we can rhetorically condemn human rights abuses in Venezuela, for example, but that doesn't mean we have a duty to send in the Marines to secure the rights of Venezuelans.
Right. But of course, then the question is, do we really know what is going on in these other countries? And that was another John Quincy Adams point. He said, the whole idea of intervention presumes you know the facts about what's happening in other countries. And the more you look into it, the more you find that all of our interventions in the last, at least since World War II, have been based on partially faulty and sometimes grossly erroneous analysis of what the situation was actually like in those countries. How many people really knew what was going on in Vietnam at the time we decided we needed to be involved there? Or how many people really understood what was happening in Iraq when we thought we would roll in there? And I mean, there were high government officials who thought we would roll in there and be welcomed in the same way that Americans were welcomed in Paris at the end of World War II. And it didn't happen. And people in our government were amazed, like, wait a minute, why? Why don't they love us? Why don't they cheer us? But I should add this other point, that is from the point of view of the founders, intervention, not only will intervention not work because we don't know, not only is it not our business, but it's an actual violation of the rights of other nations for us to try to rule them without their consent. That's what the principles of the Declaration mean, is each nation has the right to its own self-rule. And it doesn't change the fact we can claim that some other nation is ruled badly by some dictator, it doesn't change it when we come in and become the dictator.
But there are some clear cases of tyranny, right? A ruthless dictator who oppresses his people. Saddam Hussein. Why couldn't we go in and topple him and not become the dictator, but establish a democracy? That's the consensus view amongst the smart people in DC who do foreign policy for a living, right? You get rid of the bad guys, and then you hang around and help them build democracies. Now, I realize I'm trying to play devil's advocate here after
Go for it.
after the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah,
So that's hard to do. But
bringing up Iraq, okay, so the first thing we did after we toppled the government was to bring in Paul Bremer, who was in effect our proconsul. There's one of the books on this question of American foreign policy that was published maybe 20 years ago or so is called Proconsuls, as if we're the Roman Empire sending proconsuls around the world to organize and govern our colonies. And so instead of transitioning Iraq to democracy, Paul Bremer ruled that place like his own personal fiefdom for several years, or he and whoever his successors were. We didn't create democracy. And then, in fact, when there was an actual vote and too many people from one side won, from our point of view, we said, well, that election doesn't count. I mean, the insanity of it. Yeah, we're for democracy, except it has to be the right kind, and the right people have to win. Once again, we don't know what we're doing, and it's unjust for us to try to rule these people without their consent.
So would you go so far as to say that the founders were isolationists, to use, again, language that they would not have used, but that, the foreign policy debate today basically boils down the way it's presented in the media. You're either an interventionist or an isolationist. So you said the founders were not interventionists. Does this make them isolationists?
No, for obvious reasons. First of all, there's the problem of American shipping, commerce. From the point of view of the founders, one of the jobs of the government regarding foreign policy is to protect Americans who are abroad, especially on the high seas. And that means you need a navy. That means
they're pirates.
Piracy, you had British attacking our shipping and taking people off ships and turning them into British sailors. The French were attacked. I mean, everybody was attacked. So because we had a minimal navy, we didn't have enough money to buy a real navy. That's something they had to do, and they did. They built up a credible navy to the point where American shipping was protected all over the world. Secondly, America cannot be isolationist with regard to its near abroad. Right from the beginning, Hamilton in Federalist 11 announced we need something like what later became called a Monroe Doctrine. We can't be indifferent to intervention of Europeans in the countries that are close to us in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to intervene and change the governments of the Western Hemisphere, but if the Europeans try to intrude, that's something we think we need to do something about. And by the way, in the Monroe Doctrine, in exchange for that, the Americans pledged not to involve themselves in European affairs, a pledge that was honored up until 1914. And the third kind of non-interventionist, I mean, American did have a kind of interventionist foreign policy with regard to its own near abroad in its own territories. And that's the Indian question. What was going to happen with these tribes of people who didn't want to become American citizens, but who wanted to maintain a kind of sovereignty within the borders of the American Republic? And that was a huge struggle all the way throughout the 19th century. And it was, I don't know if you want to call it a foreign policy or domestic policy question, because it was a little of each.
But I can think of two other big ones: trade and immigration, where, a strictly isolationist country would not trade with the rest of the world. It would aim for autarky, and it would not take in immigrants from foreign nations.
Right. Yeah, I left those out because they don't involve military force. But yes, you're right in those two other respects. And that was, when Washington in his farewell address kind of sketched out the whole picture that I'm describing right now of what American foreign policy needs to look like. I won't say the whole picture, but much of it. And one of the things he emphasized was we need to have as little connection as possible with other countries in a political way, but always encourage commerce with other countries when it's to our advantage and benefit.
So how did the founders think about trade? Or to put the question more bluntly and in contemporary terms, was there any protectionism in their thinking when it comes to trade, or were they full-blown open borders, trade with anyone on any terms, it doesn't matter?
Their view of that was somewhat complicated because they often made the statement, ideally, we would like free trade with all nations. But there was always the qualification, as long as it's in our interest, as long as it's in the interest of the American people and the American nation.
That's a big qualification.
It is a big, and so therefore, the first law actually that was ever passed in our federal government was the Tariff Act of 1789. And in that act, in the preamble, it says the purpose of the tariff is in part to protect American industry. Why? Because what wasn't mentioned in the act, but was mentioned in the congressional debates, was national defense. We need to be able to provide for the things we need in this country in case of trade being cut off, in case of war. There was never an assumption at the time of the founding that there would ever be eternal peace, or that commerce would make everybody peaceful. They knew wars would come. We need to be ready for them. And so tariffs, for sure. Now, the debate over how much tariff was always one of the big sticking points in the early republic. A lot of big fights over that. No one ever disagreed with the idea that we need some protection. And after the War of 1812, Jefferson kind of reversed course on that and specifically said, we need protection, but we need to especially do whatever we can to encourage, American industry as much as possible from any competition, insofar as that is going to affect our future ability to fight war. Because there had been an ammunition and arms problem during the War of 1812. And Jefferson, never again. We're not going to have that. We need our own industry, whatever the virtues might be of an agrarian republic that I talked about in my earlier writings. So trade policy was something that the founders thought we should do and have treaties with other nations, but always with a view to what is it that makes it possible for us to maintain ourselves as an independent nation.
And this example illustrates one of the broad themes running through your book, is that there can be a broad agreement about a principle and then heated partisan disagreements over how to apply it. And so a scholar can say, look, there's Jefferson, there's Hamilton, there is no consensus on the founding, but that's perfectly, these debates are compatible with an agreement that it is not illegitimate for the government to protect some industries. The debate is over which ones, how, when, and why.
And the same truth can be applied to the early debates over whether America should incline more towards France or towards Britain in the 1790s. Well, the French and the British were fighting it out. One question that came up was, should we continue to follow the treaty with France that required us to aid France in case of war? And both Jefferson and Hamilton, although they had somewhat different takes on the question, they both figured out that we need to find a way to not have to do that. Jefferson said we should honor the treaty in theory, but we should find excuses about why we can't send any aid over right now. That was his bottom line on the question. And Hamilton wasn't really that different. Scholars tend to make this all a huge, big battle and, purpose of foreign policy. The other point they agreed on was they both were criticized the French Revolution for trying to spread the principles of freedom and democracy to other European nations that were at that time ruled by monarchies. Very similar to what people today say should be the purpose of foreign policy. But both Jefferson and Hamilton, the supposed great rivals, agreed that's bad. Jefferson said it's a violation of the law of nations for one nation to try to impose its form of government on other nations. And Hamilton similarly. That was the older view. The law of nations, meaning the rights of every nation to be free and independent of other nations. The second paragraph of the Declaration makes that clear. The laws of nature and nature's God allow every nation to have a separate and equal station among the nations of the earth. And that's why we're declaring independence. That's a right of other nations. Every one nation has the right to its own independence. Non-interference is a fundamental right, but it's a duty also of all nations not to interfere with the internal affairs of other nations. And that's why Jefferson said it was a violation of the law of nations for the French to try to impose democracy on the rest of Europe.
What about immigration? The view today, we're a nation of immigrants. The more immigrants, the better. They're doing the jobs that Americans won't do. I mean, if there is one thing on which there is bipartisan agreement in D.C. at the top levels, is that immigration is good, and the more immigration, the better. How did the founders think about whether we should have immigration? What's the selection principle for immigrants? Try to present for us their view on this issue.
Look, their view of immigration was always based on the question of what is it that makes Americans a people, one people, that is capable of living together harmoniously and respectfully of each other's rights, that would share a common concern with justice and right, so that in trials, jury trials and so on, people would understand the importance of enforcing the law neutrally among all of that. The question always was, how many immigrants can we take and from where? Whatever the answer to that question is, it has to be something that will lead to a continual solidity, strength, and capacity for self-government in the American people.
So we're concerned with assimilation, integration, having the immigrants dissolve almost into the existing people.
Exactly. So when Jefferson was talking about this question of immigration in his book, Notes on Virginia, he said, think of the situation if 20 million Republican Americans were suddenly settled in the middle of France. What would be the disruption to their government, their monarchy? He was implying that would just be a huge disruptive element. And Jefferson's point, the same would be true here if all of a sudden 20 million Frenchmen were dumped in America. Meaning, and his point wasn't we need to ban immigration from France. His point was whatever immigration we get from Europe, it has to be gradual. It can't be too great. And he was specifically addressing the question of should immigration be encouraged into America? And Jefferson said, no, that's not a good idea at this point. We should allow it. Right now, we're okay. We can absorb the people, but not encourage it. And that became the principle throughout. Hamilton adopted the same argument against the idea that we should make naturalization easier. He said, look, we got to make these people wait. Make them assimilate. Make them become Americans first. Let them wait a while to get their citizenship.
And they only wanted immigration from Europe initially?
Yes, exactly. That was not actually ever in the law. They had a law about naturalization that limited naturalization to free white people of good character. And the expectation was that all immigration, therefore, would be from Europe. Actual immigration policy was handled at the state level at the seaports in different states. Boston, Baltimore, South Carolina, Charleston. The states themselves decided on immigration policy. And mostly the policy was only immigrants, only Europeans, but also show that you were able to not become a public charge. You have to show that you're able to either have a job or you know someone who will take care of you. We're not going to let you in if you're just coming here destitute and coming off the boat. They'd send them back. So that was states, and it was done haphazardly, state by state. It wasn't until the 1880s that there was an actual national immigration limit policy.
So, judged from the perspective of the founding, what would you make of America's contemporary immigration policies since 1965, the Hart-Celler Act?
Up until that point, there still was a general preference for European immigration, although other places of origin were permitted. The first time the naturalization law changed.
And by the way, just the justification is that's the part of the world with whom we have the closest cultural affinities. They're the likeliest to assimilate to our way of life compared to someone from Africa or Asia.
Yeah, exactly. And, they're Christians. They're from countries that mostly have something like the rule of law the way we do. They're people who have, especially if they're from Northwestern Europe, they're going to be people who share many of the same customs and traditions we have. None of that was ever made a theme. Nobody wrote long essays on the importance of immigration being limited, but there was a quiet general consensus on that. It was present really throughout America until the Civil War. Now, of course, once you had Black citizenship after the Civil War, then the idea that limiting naturalization to white people made less sense. And so they changed the Naturalization Act to include only two categories of people in the world, whites and black. If you're from African ancestry or European, basically. No one else in the world at that time, at the age of 1870 or so, had the right to become naturalized as American citizens. Now, in practice, of course, people came over the border informally and so on. There was lots of ways in which that wasn't actually strictly enforced. But it's kind of interesting to me that the nation decided almost, you might say, unofficially or officially after the Civil War to be a biracial nation, not a multiracial.
Mm-hmm.
And when more and more Asian immigration began to take place, that's when the federal government began to limit that. But it was always with a view to how do we maintain ourselves as one people where people get along with each other, where they trust each other, where they can be counted on to give fair jury verdicts for each other, treat people. And that was the goal. Of course, not never really achieved, but goal. That was the goal, the purpose.
That's just what I find so interesting about this conversation we're having, is this constant contrast you're drawing between America as the founders thought of it and America as it exists today. What remains, what has changed, I find that's really illuminating. In the next session, we're going to cover the government's role in promoting morality, how the founders thought about virtue.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about America's founding or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you can find over 40 free online courses, including American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, Ancient Christianity, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thank you for listening.